If you're going to fail, Ethan Caldwell said, lifting his glass just high enough for the chandelier light to catch the amber liquid, at least do it where everyone can see. The room responded with polite laughter, the kind that carried just enough edge to signal allegiance, not humor. And in that moment, every eye shifted, not to him, but to the woman standing quietly at the edge of the table, a tray balanced steadily in her hand, as if the weight of the entire evening rested there and nowhere else. Claire Bennett didn't move. Not immediately. The music continued, soft jazz curling through the air like something expensive and forgettable, while the golden glow of the ballroom reflected off crystal glasses, polished silverware, and the kind of watches that cost more than most people made in a year. She stepped forward only when silence stretched a second too long, her posture straight, her expression neutral, her presence almost invisible except for the way it now held the center of the room. Ethan watched her the way he watched markets, calculating, detached, already convinced of the outcome. He had built his reputation on reading people faster than they could read themselves, on finding the weakest link in any system and applying just enough pressure to watch it break. And tonight, under the quiet weight of 100 watching eyes, Claire Bennett was supposed to be that link. "Tell me," he continued, his tone smooth, almost generous, "what would you recommend pairing with a 1989 Bordeaux of this caliber?" A few guests exchanged glances, subtle smiles forming, because everyone understood the game even if no one said it out loud. This wasn't a question. It was a stage. Claire set the tray down without a sound, her fingers steady, her movements precise, as if she had rehearsed this moment in some other life no one in this room knew about. For a brief second, her eyes lifted, not in defiance, not in fear, but in quiet acknowledgement of the man who had just placed her under a spotlight she never asked for. "It depends," she said, her voice soft but clear enough to travel across the table, "on whether you're referring to the label or the wine itself." The laughter died before it could fully form. Ethan's smile didn't disappear, but it paused, just slightly, like a clock missing a beat. Around them, the room held its breath without realizing it had done so, the subtle clink of glass against glass fading into the background as something else began to take shape. Something slower, quieter, but far more dangerous than embarrassment. Claire's gaze dropped briefly to the bottle in his hand, then to the small printed card beside it, then back to him, and there was no arrogance in her expression, no attempt to challenge, only a calm certainty that didn't belong to someone who was supposed to fail. Ethan leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually, as if none of this mattered, as if the outcome had already been decided, but his eyes sharpened, narrowing just enough to signal interest. He had expected hesitation. He had expected confusion. What he saw instead was something else entirely. And for the first time that evening, the man who controlled the room realized he might not be the one controlling this moment at all. No one spoke, not because they were confused, but because they were waiting for the moment she would hesitate, for the crack in her composure, for the tiny misstep that would justify the smirks already forming at the edges of polished smiles. Claire did not give them that moment. She reached for the bottle only after a brief pause, her fingers careful, respectful, as if handling something more fragile than glass. She did not rush. She did not perform. She simply observed. The label, the seal, the faint discoloration near the neck that most would never notice unless they were looking for something wrong. Ethan watched her every movement now, no longer casually, no longer dismissively. There was a shift in his posture, subtle but real, the kind that only happened when curiosity replaced certainty. He had seen confidence before. He had bought it, broken it, reshaped it. This was not confidence. This was control. "Go on," he said, quieter this time, though still loud enough for the table to hear. "Enlighten us." Claire set the bottle back down with the same measured precision and lifted her gaze, not to the crowd, but directly to him. It was not a challenge. It was something more dangerous. It was calm. "A wine like this," she began, her voice even, "would usually pair well with something that does not compete with its age. Something simple, balanced, respectful of the structure." A few heads nodded, cautiously, as if recognizing fragments of truth, but not yet willing to commit to it. She continued before anyone could interrupt, before the tension could dissolve into safe territory. "But that assumes the wine is what it claims to be. The sentence landed softly. Too softly. It took a second for its meaning to settle, and when it did, the air in the room shifted in a way that no one could ignore. Ethan did not move. His fingers tightened just slightly around the stem of his glass, the only visible sign that something had changed beneath the surface. "Careful," someone murmured from the far end of the table, half amused, half warning, as if the entire situation had just stepped onto thinner ice. Claire did not look away. "The vintage listed here," she said, gesturing lightly toward the printed card beside the bottle, "does not match the wear on the cork. And the seal," she paused, not for effect, but because she was certain, was reapplied. A ripple moved through the guests now, quieter than before, more controlled, but unmistakable. This was no longer entertainment. This was risk. Ethan leaned forward, slowly, placing his glass down with deliberate care. The faint sound it made against the table felt louder than it should have. "Are you suggesting," he said, his voice measured, each word chosen with precision, "that this bottle is not authentic?" Claire's expression did not change. Not triumph. Not fear. Only clarity. "I am suggesting," she replied, "that if it is opened in front of your investors, the question will not be whether it is authentic. The question will be why it was not verified before it reached this table." Silence followed. Not the polite kind. The real kind. The kind that exposes more than words ever could. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell was no longer the man watching someone else fail. He was the man being watched. The silence did not break. It stretched, settled, and pressed against every polished surface in the room until even the smallest movement felt too loud. Ethan did not look at Claire now. He looked at the bottle, not as a host, not as a collector, but as a man recalculating. His mind moved fast, tracing every step that had brought that bottle to this table, every assistant, every vendor, every quiet exchange that he had trusted without question. Around him, the guests shifted in their seats, not speaking, but listening in a different way now. This was no longer a performance. It was a possibility. A dangerous one. "You are making a serious claim," Ethan said at last, his voice lower, stripped of the earlier ease that had drawn laughter from the room. It was not anger. It was precision. Claire nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the weight of what she had just said. "I am describing a discrepancy," she replied. "What you choose to call it depends on what you find when you look closer." The distinction was subtle, but it landed with force. She had not accused him. She had not challenged his authority. She had simply placed the truth within reach and stepped back. Ethan's gaze lifted, scanning the table, the faces of investors, partners, men who had built empires and men who had lost them, all watching him now with a quiet interest that felt sharper than judgment. Reputation, he knew, did not collapse loudly. It shifted, quietly, like this. He reached for the bottle again, this time not to display it, but to examine it. His thumb brushed the edge of the seal, feeling for something invisible, something only someone who knew exactly what to look for would notice. For a fraction of a second, his expression changed. Not enough for most. Enough for Claire. "Who verified this shipment?" he asked, not to her, but to the man seated 2 places to his right. A pause. Then another. The man cleared his throat, adjusting his cufflink as if the answer might be hidden there. "It came through the usual distributor," he said carefully. "Everything was documented." Documented. Not confirmed. Ethan heard the difference immediately. His eyes flicked back to Claire. Sharper now, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that she might be guessing. There was none. She stood exactly as she had before, hands still, expression composed, as if this moment did not belong to her at all. "You noticed this just now?" Ethan asked. Claire shook her head slightly. "When I set the table," she said. "The card was printed before the bottle arrived. The codes did not match." A murmur moved through the guests again, quieter than before, but heavier, carrying something closer to respect than amusement. She had seen it before he had. Before any of them had. Not because she had been looking for it, but because she had been paying attention. Ethan leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, the faintest sign of tension escaping in a way that only someone watching closely would catch. He could dismiss her. He could laugh it off. He could open the bottle and force the night forward as if nothing had changed. But he also knew what would happen if she was right. Cameras. Headlines. Questions that did not go away. He picked up the small printed card, studying it again, this time not as a formality, but as evidence. Then he set it down, deliberately. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning his attention back to the table, his tone composed, controlled, but no longer casual. "It seems we may have overlooked a detail." The phrasing was careful, neutral. It gave him room to move. But it also did something else. It acknowledged that something had been missed. And everyone in the room knew who had found it. Claire did not smile. She did not react. She simply stepped back half a pace, returning to the edge of the scene, as if she had never been at the center of it. But the shift had already happened. The room no longer saw her as part of the background. And Ethan Caldwell, for the first time that night, was no longer the only one controlling the narrative. The room did not return to normal. It pretended to. Glasses were lifted again, conversations resumed in softer tones, and someone at the far end made a comment about market volatility as if that had been the most interesting thing of the evening. But the center had shifted, and everyone felt it. Ethan knew it most of all. He did not rush to fix the situation. Rushing would signal uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one thing he had spent his entire career eliminating. Instead, he stood, slow and deliberate, adjusting his jacket with the same controlled precision that had once made boardrooms fall silent before he even spoke. "We will pause the tasting," he said, his voice steady, carrying easily across the room without needing to rise. "There is no reason to proceed until we confirm the integrity of what is being presented." It sounded reasonable. It sounded responsible. But beneath it, there was something else. An acknowledgement that the evening had slipped, if only slightly, beyond his control. The staff moved quickly after that, quieter than before, more careful, as if every step might be observed, analyzed, remembered. A manager approached, speaking in hushed tones, while another staff member discreetly removed the bottle from the table. Claire did not follow it with her eyes. She had already seen enough. Instead, she reached for the tray she had set aside earlier, lifting it with the same calm steadiness that had carried her through the moment that had just unfolded. She should have faded back into the rhythm of the room. That was what someone in her position was expected to do. Serve. Step back. Disappear. But something had changed, and even the silence around her now felt different. Not dismissive. Not invisible. Observant. Ethan watched her again, not openly this time, but from the edge of his awareness, the way he watched variables he had not yet decided how to handle. She was no longer a passing detail. She was a question, one he had not prepared for. "Miss Bennett," he said, not loudly, but enough that she stopped. The use of her name carried its own weight. Someone had told him. Someone always did. Claire turned, meeting his gaze without hesitation, though there was no challenge in her expression, only a quiet readiness to respond. "Yes, sir." The word was neutral, respectful, unaffected by what had just happened. Ethan took a step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to lower the distance between them in a way that shifted the dynamic just slightly. "Walk me through it," he said. Not a command, not quite a request, something in between. Claire held his gaze for a moment, as if measuring how much to say, not out of fear, but out of discipline. Then she spoke. "The card was printed early," she said, before final confirmation. "The bottle arrived later. Different distributor code. The seal was reapplied, but not cleanly. It caught the light." Her words were simple, direct, no embellishment, no attempt to impress, just facts, placed carefully, like pieces on a board she understood better than anyone expected. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though his mind was already moving, tracing the implications beyond the room, beyond the evening, into the network of decisions that had allowed something like this to happen under his name. "And you said nothing," he noted. Claire's answer came without delay. "There was no reason to," she said. Until there was. The response lingered between them, quiet but unmistakable. She had not acted to expose. She had acted when it mattered, when it would change something. Ethan exhaled slowly, the smallest release of tension, before straightening again, his composure settling back into place like a perfectly tailored suit. "You understand," he said, "that you have just altered the course of this evening." Claire gave the slightest nod. "I understand that it was already altering," she replied. "You just had not seen it yet." For a fraction of a second, something shifted in Ethan's expression. Not irritation, Not disbelief. Recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar calm that had built his empire. But the difference remained. He was no longer speaking to a waitress he expected to fail. He was speaking to someone who had already proven that she would not. The evening did not collapse, but it did not recover either. It hovered in that fragile space where everything still functioned, yet nothing felt certain anymore. Conversations resumed, but slower now, more deliberate, as if each word needed to pass through a filter before being spoken. The investors were no longer watching the presentation. They were watching Ethan, and Ethan knew it. He turned slightly, addressing the group again, his voice composed, measured, carrying the authority that had built his name. "We will proceed with a different selection," he said. "One that has been verified personally." The wording was intentional. It placed distance between him and the mistake without denying its existence. A subtle correction. A quiet reclaiming of control. A server stepped forward with another bottle, this one handled with almost ceremonial care, its seal intact, its documentation confirmed twice over in less than a minute. Efficiency had returned, but the memory of what had just happened remained, like a reflection that refused to disappear even when the light shifted. Claire moved again, returning to her role with seamless precision, refilling glasses, adjusting placements, her presence once more blending into the rhythm of service. But it was no longer the same invisibility. Now, when she passed a table, people noticed. Not openly, not obviously, but enough. Ethan accepted the new glass when it was offered, swirling it once, watching the way the liquid caught the light, but his focus was elsewhere. He was replaying the moment, not the mistake, the interruption, the timing, the decision. She had not spoken too early, not too late, exactly when it mattered. That was not luck. That was judgment. And judgment like that was not common. He took a small sip, then set the glass down, barely tasting it. "Enjoy," he said to the table, his tone smooth again, but quieter than before. The guests nodded, some smiling, some still thoughtful, but all aware that the evening had taken a turn they would remember long after the wine was forgotten. Across the room, a senior partner leaned toward another, whispering something that made the second man glance briefly toward Claire before looking away. Respect moved differently than curiosity. It stayed longer. Ethan noticed that too. He always noticed patterns. And now there was a new one forming around her. He stepped away from the table for a moment, just enough to create space, just enough to think without being observed too closely. From where he stood, he could see the entire room, the investors, the staff, the quiet choreography of wealth and service moving together in practiced harmony. And within it, one variable that no longer fit the pattern he expected. Claire Bennett. Not because she had spoken, but because she had chosen when to speak. He turned back, his gaze finding her again as she placed a glass gently in front of a guest who thanked her with a nod that carried more weight than courtesy. She acknowledged it the same way she had acknowledged everything that evening. Calm, contained, unmoved. Ethan walked back toward the table, slower this time, not as a man reclaiming control, but as one reassessing it. When he reached his seat, he did not sit immediately. Instead, he looked at the empty space where the first bottle had been, then at the new one now in its place. A correction had been made, but the shift beneath it remained. "Miss Bennett," he said again, not raising his voice, but not disguising the intent either. The room did not fall silent this time, but it listened. Claire turned once more, meeting his gaze with the same quiet steadiness. "Yes, sir." Ethan held that moment just long enough for everyone to feel it, then spoke. "After service," he said, "I would like a word." It was not a request, but it was not the same kind of command as before. Something in it had changed. Claire gave a small nod. "Of course." And just like that, she turned back to her work, leaving Ethan standing there for half a second longer than he intended, aware of something unfamiliar settling beneath his composure. Not loss of control. Not quite. But the realization that control, like reputation, could shift in ways no one saw coming. And that sometimes, the person who shifted it did so without raising their voice at all. The rest of the evening unfolded with a precision that felt almost forced, as if every movement in the room had been recalibrated after a subtle but undeniable disruption. Plates arrived exactly on time. Glasses were never left empty, and the low hum of conversation gradually rebuilt itself into something resembling normalcy, but the tone had changed. It was quieter now, sharper. People were no longer simply attending a dinner. They were witnessing a shift, even if they could not fully explain it. Claire moved through it all with the same measured rhythm, her steps unhurried, her attention exact, as if nothing about the night had altered her role. But beneath that composure, there was awareness. She could feel the glances that lingered a fraction too long, the conversations that paused when she approached, the subtle recalibration of how she was seen. Not as decoration, not as background, as someone who had already proven she could not be dismissed. Ethan remained at the center of the table, engaged, articulate, answering questions, guiding discussions back toward investments and strategy. But there was a difference in the way he held himself now. Less performative, more deliberate. Every word placed with care, every response measured not only for impact, but for what it revealed. Control, he understood, was not just about commanding attention. It was about managing perception after it had shifted. And tonight, perception had shifted. When the final course was cleared and the last glasses of wine were set down, the evening began its quiet descent toward conclusion. Guests rose gradually, offering handshakes, polite smiles, brief exchanges that carried the weight of future decisions. Business would continue. Deals would still be made. But something from this night would follow them beyond the room. Claire stood near the service station as the flow of people moved toward the exit, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her posture still composed, still unremarkable to anyone who chose not to look closely. She had returned to stillness. But it was not the same stillness as before. It was chosen, not imposed. Ethan did not approach immediately. He remained where he was, finishing a final conversation with one of his senior investors, his tone calm, his expression steady, but his attention divided. He was aware of her position in the room without needing to look. When the last handshake ended and the final guest stepped away, the space shifted again. Not empty, but quieter, more honest. Ethan adjusted his cuff, a small, habitual motion, then turned and walked toward her, not quickly, not slowly, but with the same controlled pace that defined everything he did. Claire did not move as he approached. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She simply waited. "Miss Bennett," he said, stopping a few feet away, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain the boundary she had never crossed. His voice was different now, not softened, but stripped of something unnecessary. "You saw something my entire team did not." It was not a question. It was a statement. Claire met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "I noticed a detail," she replied. "There is a difference." Ethan studied her for a moment, longer than most people would have been comfortable with, but she did not look away. There was no need. "And you chose to speak," he said. Claire gave a slight nod. "Because it mattered." The simplicity of the answer settled between them, heavier than anything more elaborate could have been. Ethan exhaled quietly, a controlled release, then shifted his stance just enough to signal that this was no longer part of the performance of the evening. "Do you understand?" he said. "What would have happened if that bottle had been opened?" Claire did not hesitate. "Yes." He watched her, searching again for exaggeration, for uncertainty, for any sign that she did not fully grasp the scale of what she had intervened in. He found none. "And yet," he continued, "you did not bring it to anyone's attention until I asked you a question." Claire's response was immediate. No one was asking the right one. The words were quiet, but they carried with them a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Ethan held her gaze, and for a brief moment, the distance between them was not defined by status or role, but by understanding. He had tested her, publicly, deliberately, and she had not only answered, she had changed the outcome. Not by force, not by defiance, but by timing, precision, and restraint. He straightened slightly, the familiar composure returning, but not in the same form as before. This time, it carried something new. "You have a way of seeing things," he said. Claire did not respond to the compliment. She did not need to, because it was not one. It was recognition. And in that quiet space, after the room had emptied and the performance had ended, it was the first thing Ethan Caldwell had said all night that was entirely true. The room had emptied, but the air had not. It still carried the weight of what had happened, the quiet echo of a moment that had shifted more than just an evening. Claire remained where she stood, her hands resting lightly against the polished surface of the service counter, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. Ethan did not leave. That alone was unusual. Men like him did not linger. They moved forward, from room to room, decision to decision, never pausing long enough for reflection to catch up. But tonight was different. He looked at her again, not with curiosity this time, but with something closer to evaluation. Not of her role, of her capacity. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his tone controlled, but no longer carrying the edge of a test. Claire did not answer immediately. She held his gaze for a moment, as if deciding how much truth the question deserved. "I pay attention," she said. The answer was simple. Too simple for most people. But Ethan did not dismiss it. Because he knew better. Attention, real attention, was rare. It was what separated those who reacted from those who anticipated. "That is not what I asked," he said, not sharply, but with quiet insistence. Claire's eyes lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought. When she looked back up, there was no hesitation. "I studied hospitality management," she said. Before I stopped. The last part was not explained. It did not need to be. Ethan registered it anyway. Something unfinished. Something interrupted. He nodded once, absorbing the information, then shifted slightly, his stance more relaxed than it had been all evening, though the control remained. "You see discrepancies in seconds," he said. "You understand timing. You speak only when it changes the outcome." He paused, just long enough for the weight of his next words to settle. "That is not common." Claire did not react to the observation. She did not accept it as praise. She did not reject it either. She simply let it exist, the same way she had let everything else unfold that night. "Most people are not looking," she said. "They are waiting to be right." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. But it did not fully form. Because he understood exactly what she meant. He had spent years surrounding himself with people who anticipated his expectations, who shaped their responses to match what he already believed. Efficient, predictable, safe. And yet, tonight, the one person who had changed the trajectory of his event had not been trying to be right. She had been trying to be accurate. There was a difference, and it mattered. He glanced briefly toward the exit, where the last of the staff had disappeared into the hallway, then back at her. The space between them felt different now, less defined by hierarchy, more by something unspoken. "You did not embarrass me," he said suddenly. The statement seemed out of place, but it was not. Claire's gaze shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of what he was really saying. "You could have," he continued. "You had the information, the timing, the audience." He let that settle, then added, quieter, "You chose not to." Claire held his gaze, steady as before. "That was not the point," she said. Ethan studied her again, longer this time, as if trying to understand a framework that did not operate the way he was used to. "Most people would have taken that opportunity," he said. Claire's response came without hesitation. "Most people want to be seen winning," she said. "That is not the same as solving the problem." The words landed with quiet force, not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise. Ethan exhaled slowly, the faintest shift in his composure revealing something he did not often show. Not uncertainty, but recognition of a perspective he had not considered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was clear. Then Ethan straightened, the familiar structure of his presence returning, but not unchanged. "You are working the late shift tomorrow?" he asked. Claire nodded once. "Yes." He considered that for a brief second, then gave a small, decisive nod of his own. "Good," he said. And just like that, the conversation ended. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because whatever came next would not happen in a room like this, under lights that reflected status more than truth. Claire watched him turn and walk away, his steps measured, his posture composed, his presence once again filling the space he moved through. But something had shifted, not in how he carried himself, in how he had looked at her. And for the first time that night, the balance between them no longer felt one-sided. The next evening did not carry the same glow of spectacle, but it carried something more revealing. The lights were softer, the crowd thinner, and the rhythm of the restaurant settled into something closer to truth than performance. Claire moved through her shift with the same precision as always, her steps quiet, her attention exact, her presence blending into the background in a way that now felt almost deliberate. Those who had been there the night before still recognized her, though none approached, None mentioned what had happened, as if speaking it aloud might change its meaning. But the memory lingered in the way they watched, in the way they listened when she spoke, even in something as simple as asking for water. Respect did not announce itself. It adjusted behavior. Ethan arrived without announcement, without the subtle signals that usually preceded his presence. No assistant, no entourage, just a man in a tailored coat, stepping into a space where he was used to being recognized immediately and choosing, for once, not to draw attention to it. He took a table near the back, not the center, not the one reserved for visibility, but one that allowed him to observe without interruption. Claire noticed him the moment he entered, not because she was looking for him, because she noticed everything. She did not approach right away. She finished the table she was serving, placed a glass with steady hands, acknowledged a quiet thank you, and only then walked toward him, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. "Good evening," she said, her tone neutral, professional, as if the conversation from the night before had been filed away, not forgotten, but placed where it would not interfere with the present. Ethan looked up, and for a brief second, there was something different in his expression. Not surprise, not curiosity, something closer to intent. "Miss Bennett," he said, not as a title, but as recognition. He did not reach for a menu. He did not look around. His attention stayed on her. "What would you recommend?" The question sounded ordinary. It was not. Claire understood that immediately. It was not about the food. It was not about the wine. It was about something else entirely. She did not answer right away. She allowed a brief pause, just long enough to signal that she was considering the question on its actual terms, not the surface one. "That depends," she said, echoing the structure from the night before, but with a different weight now, on whether you are asking as a guest or as someone evaluating the answer. Ethan leaned back slightly, a faint shift that acknowledged the precision of her response. "As someone who does not want the wrong thing," he said. Claire nodded once. That, at least, was honest. She gestured lightly toward the menu, not opening it, not pointing to anything specific, but framing the space between them as something shared rather than dictated. "Then I would recommend something simple," she said. "Something that does not try to prove anything." Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, accepting the answer without pressing further. "I will trust your judgment," he said. The words were quiet, measured, but they carried more weight than any order he had given the night before. Claire wrote it down without comment, her pen moving with the same steady rhythm, then looked back up. "I will bring something appropriate," she said. "Not impressive, not expensive, appropriate." Ethan watched her for a second as she turned to leave, the movement smooth, unhurried, unforced. There was no performance in it, no attempt to hold his attention. And yet, she did, more than anyone else in the room. He glanced around briefly, taking in the quieter space, the absence of spectacle, the lack of an audience that needed to be managed or influenced. This was different, not less important, more precise. When Claire returned, she placed the dish in front of him with the same care she had shown the night before, but without the weight of scrutiny. He looked at it, then at her, as if confirming something that did not need to be said. "You are consistent," he noted. Claire met his gaze. "Consistency is easier than correction," she replied. Ethan almost smiled again. This time, it stayed a fraction longer. Not fully, but enough. Enough to suggest that whatever had shifted the night before had not settled back into place. It had evolved, quietly, and neither of them needed an audience to recognize it. The meal was not elaborate, but it was exact. Every element on the plate balanced without effort, as if nothing needed to prove its place there. Ethan noticed that immediately, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was intentional. He took a bite, slowly, without distraction, allowing the moment to exist without analysis for the first time in a long time. Across the room, Claire continued her work, moving from table to table with the same quiet rhythm, her presence never demanding attention, yet never truly disappearing. There was no tension between them now, no test waiting to unfold, only a space that had been redefined. Ethan set his fork down after a few moments, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the city lights reflected against the glass, a reminder of the world he usually controlled with ease. Numbers, decisions, outcomes, all predictable, as long as the variables behaved. But people were different. They did not always respond to pressure the way models suggested they would. Claire had not. And that difference had stayed with him longer than the evening itself. When she returned to his table, there was no hesitation in her step, no change in her expression. "Is everything satisfactory?" she asked, her tone the same as it would be for any other guest. Ethan looked up at her, holding her gaze for a moment before answering. "It is," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Exactly as it should be." Claire gave a small nod, acknowledging the words without attaching anything more to them. She reached for the glass, refilling it with the same steady precision, then stepped back slightly, allowing space rather than filling it. Ethan watched that too. The restraint. The absence of unnecessary movement. It was the same discipline she had shown the night before, but clearer now without the pressure of an audience. "You choose carefully," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. Claire met his gaze. "So do you," she replied. The response was simple, but it shifted the balance again, placing them on equal ground, not in status, but in awareness. Ethan leaned back slightly, considering her words, then nodded once, accepting the symmetry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was not empty. It was settled. When Claire turned to continue her work, Ethan did not stop her this time. He did not need to. The conversation had already reached its point. He finished his meal without distraction, without checking his phone, without dividing his attention between multiple outcomes. Just one. Present. When the check arrived, he glanced at it briefly, then reached for his pen. He did not write a number immediately. Instead, he paused, as if measuring something that could not be quantified. Then he signed his name, placed the pen down, and stood. As he adjusted his coat, his eyes moved once more across the room, finding Claire not because she stood out, but because she no longer needed to. She was where she had always been. Steady, unmoved. He walked toward the exit without calling her name, without adding anything more, because there was nothing left that required words. At the door, he stopped for just a second, not long enough for anyone to notice, but long enough to register a quiet certainty. Control had not been lost that night. It had been corrected, not by force, not by authority, but by someone who understood that the right moment mattered more than the loudest voice. Outside, the city continued as it always did, indifferent, relentless, full of people trying to be seen. Inside, Claire picked up the signed check, her eyes moving over the ink only briefly before setting it aside with the same calm precision she had applied to everything else. She did not smile. She did not react. Because the value of the